Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and you're interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you that there are 2 upcoming NARM therapist trainings starting in January 2022. One of these trainings will be offered in an online format, and the other will be offered in person in San Francisco, California. This Level 2 NARM therapist training is designed to support mental health professionals who work with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Being trained in NARM, one of the first clinical models specifically designed to address ACEs and CPTSD, supports therapists to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The NARM therapist training will be taught by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer and a team of experienced NARM training assistants. You will learn a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach. As you're learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from this team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers. If you're interested in this training, we encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. I'm happy to share today's guest with you, Chaz Franke. Chaz owns LightSource, a private practice in Belleville, Illinois. He's also an adjunct professor in the MSW program at St. Louis University. Chaz has over 15 years of experience working with trauma and has been providing clinical supervision since 2010. Please enjoy my conversation with Chaz Franke. Hello, Chaz.
Hello.
Welcome to Transforming Trauma. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Oh,
I'm excited
wonderful.
to be here.
Oh, great. I'm excited that you're excited. So you've listened, I think, to several episodes of the podcast. So you know that our first question always is, what is it that you want listeners to get out of our conversation today?
I did think about that a little bit. I have a bad habit of using a word to death. And the word that really drives my people crazy is curiosity. So my hope is that anybody that would listen to this would leave this with just like a gentle sense of how to be curious about themselves, like some avenues towards curiosity. So that way it doesn't just feel like deep dive exploratory stuff. It's deep dive, gentle curiosity is kind of what I'm hoping people come away with.
Wonderful. Well, that is super aligned with everything that we do in NARM. So we're going to have an amazing connection today. I love it. So why don't you tell folks who you are and where you're working?
Sure. So my name is Chaz Franke. I am a licensed clinical social worker in both the states of Illinois and Missouri. I currently work in a practice called LightSource that's in a little town called Belleville, which is right outside St. Louis on the Illinois side. LightSource is the practice I started a little while back. Some cute little backstory to some of it that I'm sure we'll get into. But I also teach as an adjunct in the MSW program at St. Louis University.
Wonderful. Why don't you tell us a little bit of the cute little backstory?
Well, it was a really interesting process to open a business that, you could talk about for days, like, especially. Mm-hmm. But the most fun thing was coming up with a name. And as we were thinking about what we were going to call it, you can never go wrong with a name because nobody is really,
well,
you can. I mean, I'm sure there's like, hope by the lake horizon for all.org or something out there that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But right. The person that designed our logo and helped me with the name is my tattoo artist.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. And so Amanda Pepper is her name. And Amanda helped me a lot. And I had one rule only was I wanted a lantern as a logo for whatever reason. I wanted a lantern and I wanted 2 syllables in the name. Like I just didn't want a super long name. I like 2 syllables. And so LightSource came from this idea of like, what do you need in the dark? Right? Like you just a light source. But the thought was that the lantern is just like in the dark, you just need to illuminate one more little step. You don't floodlight a dark space to see everything. You just need enough to get one more step. And that was really the thought behind the name and even the practice. My style of therapy is slower. We're making a bit of a broth in therapy. It's slow. We're not heating up a can. And so light source had to be it. It had to be just that one little space, just to get a little bit further, just illuminate. Amanda always said therapy should feel like you've got just enough light to read by.
That's really sweet.
Yeah, she's way smarter than me.
Well, we have a couple different avenues we can go down today. So I'm thinking of you as a clinician who works in addiction and trauma. I'm thinking of you as a business owner who's fostering, young clinicians in that way, and as a teacher. So, as you're answering questions today, feel free to tap into any of those different areas. But maybe you can tell us who it is primarily that you're working with in your practice.
So I have worked with trauma survivors for the better part, for your whole career, not knowing what we know about trauma, but focusing on trauma for about 15 years now. I worked with kids on a childhood trauma grant that was actually funded by a guy named Ira Chasnoff, who's up Chicago way. But I worked with childhood trauma for a long time and then moved into more adolescent, young adult trauma survivors and a lot of specialization in sexual trauma. And that's always been my space, has been working directly with trauma in a process-oriented form, not a lot of directional stuff, a lot of non-directive stuff, even some Rogerian kind of making space for whatever comes up. And I got my clinical license in 2009. And after I got a little bit more experience under my belt, started doing a lot more clinical supervision and building structure to clinical supervision that led to me getting my license in Missouri, because I was teaching it. I've always taught at St. Louis University, and that program has a lot of trauma focus, but there are not a lot of LCSW supervisors in Missouri.
Oh,
and so I really wanted to do clinical supervision to help people build that trauma informed awareness that goes beyond read a couple of books and know that trauma matters. Like I've always really wanted to help people sense like the ubiquitous nature of trauma in underlying all the things that we deal with. And knowing that, like, as a new clinician, it's so difficult to really take the risk of saying, I think there's a lot more going on here, to really build that curiosity even as a clinician. And so I've just desperately wanted to foster that piece, because I think that a lot of people coming out of school now have so much more awareness of trauma that me being put to use is just for me to be supportive of that. I'm teetering on the brink of being irrelevant in that sense of, coming from a different time educationally, so that now my experience and you can take that risk, you can ask that question, you can make that space. That's me at my best as a supervisor and as a clinician.
Two questions that spring out of that. One is, I want to hear more about your training in trauma, since I also didn't get any trauma training in my MSW program. So I'm curious what you studied that got you to where you are. And then two, I'd love to hear more about how trauma is being integrated in your program now, because it's something we've talked about in NARM, is how can we support educating new therapists and making sure that all therapists have this trauma education?
There are two big areas of introduction to working with trauma for me that are both dumb luck in a lot of ways. One is I was part of this really cool program where for hour and a half, 2 hours, once a week, we had a phone staffing with Bruce Perry. And I learned so much. It was a master class. Right.
And do you want to share, if folks who are listening don't know who that is, can you?
Yeah. Bruce Perry is a child psychiatrist and a trauma specialist who wrote Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. He wrote Born for Love. And now he's got a book out with Oprah Dr. Perry is the real deal. He built a little treatment facility outside of the Branch Davidian complex in Waco when all of that happened. Like, he was working with those kids. Like,
wow.
Dr. Perry is just awesome. And it was a master class, right? And it was him leaned back in his chair, going over some stuff, going over a case or something like that. And just amazing. And that was one of those moments where I'm like, yes, I have to do whatever he's doing. Like, I have to figure out how this works. And a lot of it was because he was so compassion first. And he was the first person that I really heard that was working hard to understand the behavior no matter what. There was no pathology to his voice. There was no symptomatology to his voice. There was only like, if this kid is doing this thing, it is a mechanism that serves them to the nines, and we should expect them to do it until we give them a good reason not to, until they have a safe place to not act that way. And he just hammered that kind of point home in a way that you just couldn't ignore. And the second space that I got really lucky was one of the first areas of specialization I ever had was working with borderline personality disorder.
Which trauma.
Yeah. And it's all trauma. It's batting 1,000. It's everybody. Yep. And what was really unfortunate and what drew the social worker me to borderline personality and people that were diagnosed with borderline personality, it was so unfortunate that people just didn't like them. People just disliked that. They saw the diagnosis. They were mad at the person. I had worked a little while in a hospital, and if a person was diagnosed with borderline, somebody was going to badmouth them behind closed doors, and the staffings were going to be negative, and people were going to be frustrated. And I'm thinking, has anybody been nice? Like, has anybody tried? Like, and if you're nice to somebody and they're mean back, well, we're in the service industry. Right? I mean, I'm a social worker. I'm here to help. And if you tell me where to go and where to take my help, okay. I might try again later, or maybe not. I don't know. It's up to you. And so I started working with borderline personality disorder and got sent off to get certified in DBT, in dialectical behavioral therapy. That doesn't always fit my style because, it's directive and linear. And so it's not really my style, but I always felt that DBT had a lot of just inarguable space, like mindfulness, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, and emotion regulation. We can't go wrong.
Can't hurt anybody.
You're never too far off a bullseye with those. And so I liked having that framework of just knowing that I could legitimize working in this space of suffering. And now I am so excited because everybody I supervise and everybody I work with, they are always looking for what's the next thing I got to learn. Everybody that I supervise is
NARM.
Scraping their yes. Like, listen, I mean, there's no cameras for this, but you can vouch. I'm right here.
He's showing the book, everybody.
I've got my healing developmental trauma. I'm on it. A wonderful therapist that I talk to a lot named Erin Grumley, who's in St. Louis. She's an eating disorder specialist. Months ago, she was like, have you ever heard of NARM? And she's like, you got to read this book. And so I have. It's wonderful. It's inarguably wonderful. And it's one of those, NARM is a good example where it's like, when somebody talks EMDR, they're talking EMDR like the certification because they want to legitimize the opportunity to work with trauma. The same way that DBT for me, I got certified in DBT in like 2008, 2007 maybe. So you would not have done DBT with somebody that wasn't diagnosed borderline at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was for borderline personality disorder. And then in a heartbeat, it was your 5th grade teacher is teaching it in a circle.
Right.
Because it has some of those inarguable points. And a lot of these models, especially an affective kind of model, can be for anybody because everybody's suffered. So when you take the high level of suffering, a traumatic style of suffering where, yes, maybe you have PTSD, maybe it's developmental trauma that is driving your current relationships, everybody hits that spectrum somewhere. So these models that reflect like understanding the survival aspects of your daily behaviors, knowing that how you are interacting with people on an intimate level is being driven by things that you maybe haven't been able to explore, that's a human concern.
Right.
Right. So our angle through it and my angle through it was through trauma, through understanding that trauma on all of these different levels can affect it. But the human piece of it is, if you've suffered, you need more understanding. When I started giving trainings on attachment and addiction, I would say certain statistics that people were kind of surprised by. And it's like, you don't have to be so surprised. Like, the idea that people that are going through awful things have really painful reactions to those awful things is not calculus. If it was calculus, no social workers would be doing it. That's why we become social workers, is to not do math.
Yeah. So, well, that's really interesting, the history with Bruce Perry and then DBT. And you mentioned before we started recording also that you are a Buddhist. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious how you implement that into your trauma work with clients, staff, students, all of it.
So my background initially was Zen. I have a long history of working in Zen Buddhism. I've had some Zen teachers. And Zen, I was really excited when I found Buddhism because I was so into the simplicity of not judging thinking. And, you never, as much as I've studied, I've been a devout Buddhist for a very long time. I'm a tantric Buddhist. And even in that devout piece, the root is still, it can be such a relief to not have to take this inner experience of who you think you are or who you think other people think you are so painfully seriously. And Zen is great for that, because Zen just kind of cuts you off at the knees. A Zen teacher just says to you, like, oh, you're mad at someone for not reacting to the version of you that you've constructed for them to see so that they can get it right every time. And you're like, well, when you put it like that, no, yes, no, yes. And then you're so confused, you're done. And so
I see. So Zen works through confusion. Got it.
Oh, 100%. Yes, 100%. The sound of one hand clapping kind of thing, where you just, right. You're just like a computer with like smoke coming out of your ears at the end of it. But I also think on a personal note, Buddhism allowed me to bring spirituality into who I was as a therapist.
Yeah.
That I wasn't going to do if this is the West. And so I grew up Catholic, and clearly I still work for the Jesuits. I don't, I don't dislike any religion. So it's not a knock on religion, but mm-hmm. I was never going to be a fully integrated spiritual therapist at all with Christianity, because it wasn't what made sense to me.
Yeah. Buddhism
made sense to me. And then to see that all of the Buddhist writing transitions into talking about understanding suffering. And then that they have entire vows that you take to where your job is to alleviate the suffering of all beings, that you're never done until that is. And what helped me with developing as a therapist in Buddhism is unapologetically about the long game. Sudden enlightenment is part of the stories because they got to fill the books. But, there's quotes and discussions of like, how long does enlightenment take? And it moves in the direction of, it takes as long as it would take a bird to wear down a mountain with a feather in its hand, flying by once a year. Right. And you're like, oh, so maybe I shouldn't put all this pressure on myself to be hurrying. Mm-hmm. And I felt that it helped me a lot, because the world of therapy, when I entered it, was, and still is in a lot of ways, but there's just levels to it. I felt really turned off by the idea of speed. There's a therapist in Tennessee named Clifton Mitchell. He's a really interesting guy, but he's a guy that I've heard him say that you never sacrifice direction for speed. And I was so turned off by this thought of like a race towards the end of therapy.
Mm-hmm. Brief treatment, 6 to 8 sessions. No, thank you.
Oh, and maybe it's an unfair way to phrase it, but I always called it name that tune therapy. Where the game is like, I can do it in 5 sessions, and then somebody goes, I can do it in 4. It's like the scene in There's Something About Mary where the Harlan Williams is going to make a ton of money because he's doing 6-minute abs because 7-minute abs are on the market.
I was like, wait, where is this going? Got it.
And Ben Stiller says, well, what if somebody makes 5-minute abs? And he goes, it can't be done, man. It can't. Like,
right.
I was turned off by speed because I thought my personal experience was, I thought a certain movement towards speed put pressure on the people that I serve to hurry. So their urgency, I understand. They're suffering.
Right.
But if they're responding to my urgency, I'm failing. And, Buddhism is what gave me the space to just be like, slow down, man. You don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's so cool. I find so much alignment between Buddhism and NARM, learning NARM. And when you were talking about taking the pressure off yourself, that's one of the really big pieces in the training that we really spend a lot of time with is how as therapists are we pressuring ourselves? How is unmanaged empathy, which is a term, Brad coined, how is unmanaged empathy entering the space? And, it's funny, I'd been in Al-Anon for several years and thought like, oh, I got my empathy under control. I'm not fixed managing and controlling people anymore. And then once I got into the training, I was like, oh no, it's still there. I am still putting pressure on my clients inadvertently because of this desire to, right. I want them to heal. I want them to feel better. And I was responding to their urgency by pressuring myself.
Yeah. Can I tell a funny story about that?
Please.
So at a certain point in Illinois, when I was working with Medicaid clients, public insurance clients, Medicaid said that they were only going to allow 10 sessions of therapy a year.
Come on.
Or not even that. It was 40 units. And a unit is 15 minutes.
No.
So all of the bosses, and I don't blame the administrators for this. This is not a job I wanted. But all the administrators just said, well, here's what we got to do. We just have to create an outpatient therapy program that is only offering 10 sessions. It was with muddy language that Medicaid kind of said, well, then you can apply for more sessions, right? You can get, reauthorization. But they kind of hinted at the idea that they weren't going to give you reauthorization, even though they kind of did, but they were hinting that it would be real hard. And I talked to a client that had seen a therapist while the 10 session stuff was really hot and heavy. I talked to a couple of clients, but one that really stood out. And I said, it did say that you successfully completed therapy, which whatever. I have a whole issue with that language anyways. But, right. And she said, well, I did. I just felt so bad. And I'm like, well, what'd you feel bad about? She said, I knew there was a lot of pressure on my therapist to be done in 10 sessions. And so after 8 sessions, I said I was feeling better because I knew I wasn't going to get better in 10 sessions. And I didn't want my therapist to feel bad that she didn't help me in 10 sessions. I thought she was great. And I thought, how often is that happening? Not just in the 10 session space, but, in the space of therapy where stuff like transference and countertransference, which we tend to mystify in some very unnecessary ways, is just like, there's a therapist in the room. Like Harry Aponte talks a lot about the self of the therapist and from a very well culturally informed piece. But when they're talking about that self of the therapist, it's just, you exist in the room. Freud didn't do anybody any favors by talking about a blank slate, especially not while Freud's smoking cigars and there's a dog in the room.
And doing cocaine in the background.
Yeah, so writing about a blank slate didn't help. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're in the room.
Right.
And so that pressure is going to be felt. That empathy is going to be felt. And sometimes that empathy can be controlling.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Something happened in a training I was part of this weekend where, so Larry is the founder. He is the co-author of the book, Healing Developmental Trauma. And he showed a video. And one of the things that we do in NARM is we invite this, what do you want for yourself, which is we call it the contract clinically. And so the client was, I can't remember what the client said, but they wanted something. And Larry just, I assume, kind of had a sense that wasn't necessarily what he wanted. And so Larry kind of asked more questions, got a little bit more curious, about what the client might have wanted. And a student asked Larry after this whole demo was over, she said, oh, I thought that was a little bit intrusive for you to not accept what the client said that they wanted for themselves. And Larry just said, well, I'm here too. just very simply said, I'm here too. And NARM has really given me an invitation to show up in the room more in such a mindful, aware way.
Yeah. That is the curious sense to me.
Yeah.
I always try to tell people, I promise to be interested. Like, I promise to be interested because I need to create a safe enough environment for a person to be able to tell me if they think I'm not. And that has always been to me, the top of the therapeutic mountain is a relationship that is strong enough for somebody to say, Chaz, what are you doing? Or are you with me? Or, like somebody that to actually be safe enough to push back in probably ways that they never have. Because that's what therapy is all about. Like, what kind of dry run do you need before you go out in the world with this level of vulnerability? Like sharing like any kind of traumatic experience, just sharing a breakup that is reflective of a difficulty connecting, that all the shame and the embarrassment and everything that comes with it, I got to be interested, and not interested like you have to be interesting.
Right.
Interested like I have to make sure that I'm in the room and I'm present, and that if I'm not, I own it. That I make sure that you can ask me those questions that you need to say, because more than anything, that sense of my interest is going to carry a lot of the process too.
Right.
Because sometimes I got to carry the interest, because with dissociation and with disconnection and with different survival skills, you can't really ask the person to stay interested in themselves that same way. They've been shutting themselves off from the world for years.
Right.
They haven't been taking up any space.
Right. Yeah. And that's a lot of what we talk about in NARM too, in terms of the connection survival style, is wanting connection and also fearing it at the same time.
I think that therapy 100% is the coolest thing in the world. I have loved doing therapy since I started doing it. Every single thing I think I'm a little bit interested in, I can quickly say, damn, therapy's a little cooler than that.
Right.
You watch, first and foremost, where else are people getting to spend in healthcare, in the helping world, 60 full minutes talking to somebody? The expectation, or the 50-minute hour, or whatever
right.
your work process is, like 60 full minutes. Everybody else is getting cut down by 10 minutes and 5 minutes and 15 minutes and faster sessions and different, doctors with door handle conversations and all these things. And yet my standard is, if I don't give you 60 minutes, you're allowed to be like, we're done already. Like, that's the best thing. And there's just no other space for that. Just 60 minutes of deep dive with a professional that knows, if we're decent at it, knows how to not let you get too far out into the ocean with it.
Right.
We're going to be able to go somewhere, and we're going to be able to come back, and you're going to surprise yourself every time we do it. That's the coolest thing. I haven't found anything cooler.
Well, while we're on that topic, I'd love to hear if you have some, inspirational stories from clients who've been healing from complex trauma.
Sure. Right off the bat, I have a couple of people that this is kind of an interesting tell with trauma. But one of the things that I think is really important with trauma is that you've got to work on the trauma, and then you've got to work on how do you operate in a world that let that happen. And I had a client one time that was 16 when I started working with her, and she's a tough kid. Like I like tough teenagers, and I feel bad because I'm about to be 40. So I'm too old to work with teenagers now. I'll never be cool again.
It's true.
I was never cool to begin with, but I was like cool enough to be your therapist. And now I'm done. I'm just toast. Like there's just no way. I just have all these tattoos hoping a teenager thinks I'm cool.
Right.
And so she came in and she was kind of tough and we got along, and she asked me, do you have any kids? And I didn't mind that disclosure because I don't. I don't have kids. So saying no doesn't really seem like too personal of a question. So I said, no, I don't. And then she goes, that sucks. And I'm like, oh, really?
Okay.
I have all my money. But I'm like, and I said, well, why? And then she said, because I bet you wouldn't let your kid get this sad.
Oh.
And that was such a big moment, even for me as a therapist, to just realize the simplicity of the relationship. That just like, of all the things that had happened to her, the world not noticing is what had been so heavy. Being allowed to get that sad before anybody said, "Are you sad?"
Yeah.
was such a massive teaching moment for me. And after that, she did well. I mean, she did well, mostly because she was coming to an age where she knew if anybody was going to notice what was going on, it was going to have to be her. She was very steadily growing into the adult she always needed. If anything, my role as the therapist was to slow her down and let her still be 16.
Right.
She was going to be 40 in a week if I didn't, just pump the brakes a little bit and ask more questions. And that was a teaching moment for me. You learn so much from clients. I mean, I started my career in Department of Corrections as a drug counselor, and I don't think I helped anybody in DOC, but man, they helped me. I mean, I learned so much in Department of Corrections. I can't even tell you. And so I would say like she helped me a lot. And another example that I think in my way is inspiring was I had a teenage client that was addicted to heroin. And we met every week like clockwork. And I would talk about treatment. You should probably go inpatient, where mom knew kind of what was going on. And I had a hard time because I kept thinking like, what am I doing meeting every week with somebody actively on heroin, right? Like, I mean, like this is not enough, right? Like I'm not doing enough. And you kind of fall back on hey, she shows up every week. She's there every week, which I agreed with. And that was kind of keeping the boat tethered to shore. But she told me a story then one week about how her mom she told her mom something that she wanted to do, some goal that she had. And her mom just said, okay, well, you're never going to do that. Mom wasn't super cool. You're never going to do that. Like, I don't know why you would think that. And then she said, nobody takes me serious, which is the ultimate teenage thought, right? It's developmentally appropriate. But at the same time, I realized I'm not taking you serious either. Like your behavior is escalating and I'm saying 11 o'clock Wednesday, like it's not enough. And the way that I could take her more seriously would be kind of the insistence on we need to do more. We have to do more. And I told her that, and it was, I don't want to say funny, but it was lucky that she said, yeah, I'll go to treatment. Like the second that I said, me letting you not go to treatment is not okay. I can't show that I'm taking you seriously until I actually do the next serious thing. And God bless her. That was the end of drugs, as far as I know. That was a while ago. I know she's years sober now. And I think the reason why those stories are so inspiring to me, where they're not like pretty. There's not like, I didn't do anything particularly therapeutic in terms of technique. There's not a lot of finesse in my approach there, but it was the idea of what happens when there's just enough openness in the room for everything that comes up to be worthy of investigation.
Well, and what I hear in that story is, you were struggling to really be interested in the client. And instead of using that as a reason to just discharge, you were curious about that and really asked yourself, what's going on with me that I'm struggling to find interest here?
I look at it like in a classroom. If you ever heard a teacher that is proud that everybody did crappy on a hard test, it's like, oh, well, the highest score in the room was a 43. So we got and it's like, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but if I got 20 students in the room and the highest score is a 43, I'm not a good teacher.
Right.
And so I look at therapy like that the same way. I feel that therapy in a lot of ways, maybe it's ivory tower stuff, I don't know. But therapy in a lot of ways got away with blaming the clients for things not going well forever.
Especially in addiction.
Yes. Well, especially in addiction where with language like non-compliance.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Non-compliance and resistance, what resistance became.
Right.
Right. Resistance as an idea related to our defenses and even like mechanisms for survival. That's not a negative to me. That's not a pejorative to me. But resistance as, oh, this person isn't ready or they're not taking this serious. Like, what? Who am I? And then we got the guts to say that we're meeting the client where they're at.
Right.
I'm going to go in one room and say behind your back that you're not ready to change, and then go in another room and say that I meet people where they're at, and then blame them for not getting better. I think we got away with murder with a lot of that stuff for a long time. And I'm not the biggest outcome-based, evidence-based all the time. If you're out doing the work a lot, you're probably on a million different fences in terms of what works and what doesn't. And BION, the old analyst used to always talk about how you need to meet a new person every conversation.
Well, and I want to kind of go back. You just said we got away with murder for a really long time. And let's be really clear. A lot of people died because of confrontational approaches in addiction. Yeah. So that's not even tongue in cheek. That's real.
Yeah. I mean, I was so surprised everywhere I've been where the general tone was just at least a baseline dislike of the people that they were serving.
Oof.
Just like a frustration that boiled over into a blame. And to me, some of that is it's tiring work and it's difficult work and it's in a lot of ways undervalued work. And so people are tired and people are worn out. And the other thing that therapists aren't necessarily well prepared for, I think, in terms of an educational sense, is how often you feel like you're doing nothing.
Yeah.
And you need really good leadership and really good support and really good supervision to be like, that was not nothing. It feels like it, and it doesn't have a big payoff, and it's 10 weeks in a row that you've been working with somebody, and they're not a million times better because of the things you've been saying, and that's okay. That's what a lot of real-time check-ins are for. How are we doing? How are you feeling with this? I just said this thing. What was it like when I said this thing? Getting feedback, getting data, keeping it in the moment. What is the experience? Where's that in your body? All of those cool questions. So that way you're even as the therapist insulating yourself from this idea of helplessness, because once you have a few failures or once you lose somebody to suicide or something like that, you're guarded. You want the manual. Like, just give me, like, I'm going to go back to just some good old fashioned CBT and teach people how to gaslight themselves and do stuff like that. And God, I'm going to get a letter. I didn't mean a CBT.
It's okay. We're aligned in that.
Okay. Having a reasonable skepticism of your thoughts is a good thing. I'm a Buddhist.
Right.
It's been done.
CBT is going to get canceled eventually. We'll see.
Oh, man. I don't know. They're so powerful.
Right.
The only bad evaluation I've ever gotten in the classroom was somebody wrote, he really had an axe to grind with CBT. And I'm like, oh my gosh, the last thing I want on this planet is to be considered negative about anything. I think whatever works. And I like to have fun and I like to joke about things. And man, when one of those jokes lands is serious, like an axe to grind and get CBT, I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean, if you like CBT, you should love it.
Back. Right.
Yeah, sorry. Ellis seemed really nice when he's yelling at Gloria in the Gloria tapes. He seems like a real sweet person. But yeah, we did get away with blaming people for things, with blaming a person with borderline personality disorder for enjoying what we called manipulative behavior. It's like, you think they're having fun?
Mm-mm.
I had a client that was hospitalized one time and she started biting the inside of her mouth as like a self-injury behavior. And it was like she's bleeding, right? Like it was bad. And apparently made a bit of a scene of it. The nurses and everybody were mad at her and they're just like, oh, it's ridiculous. She wouldn't self-harm like that at home. She only self-harms like that in the hospital, and going on and on. And I was like, can we have a moment of silence for how bad it feels to bite the inside of your mouth? You think that was a fun exercise for that person? I was in a training one time and the topic came up. This has happened to me 3 times, actually. One time pretty bad, though. The topic came up that all tattooing is self-injurious behavior to repress trauma.
Right. I sit here with my sleeve too, so I can't wait where this is going.
And the thing that came up, it was a DBT and the 12 steps training. You got to get them CEUs,
I do.
So it was a small training. It was an advertised training, but it was on like a Saturday, right? So there's like 11 people in the room. 5 minutes into this training, somebody puts their hand up and says, do you think that tattooing is self-harm? Now, I tell you that there's 11 people in the room because I'm one of the 11 people, and I am what is classified as heavily tattooed. So I'm sitting there in a short sleeve shirt with 2 sleeves of tattoos and plenty of other ones that you can't see. And I'm like, I wonder if a room full of therapists that are already in that kind of like righteous of a space, I wonder if anybody is going to say, hey, person with a bunch of tattoos, what do you think? So I just sat back. Nobody said a word. They just riffed for about a half hour about how they all have clients that say that they go to get tattoos because it's more acceptable than cutting themselves. And they go and I'm just like, yeah, there's no culture around tattooing. There's no history of tattooing. Right. And then finally the presenter said, I'm one of the only people that you're ever going to meet that feels that there is absolutely no psychological reason to put something on your body permanently. And there is no such thing as a healthy decision to get a tattoo. And I don't take it personal, right? I'm nobody to anybody in the room. But I thought, man, are we doing this to clients?
Right, exactly.
Like you guys all just showed your hand that you don't think tattoos are anything other than self-harm. So do you check yourself when a tattooed client comes in?
Right. And how invalidating, right? And we do this with all sorts of things like sexuality or literally so many things.
Yes.
Wow.
The invalidation. I think that probably the most important thing that I'm able to do to really further a curious discussion with people is the simplicity of just validate. Mm-hmm. You're feeling something. That's real. You're experiencing something. That's real. You're experiencing it a certain way. What do you think? I need to psychoeducate it out of you? What?
Right.
I don't want to do that to you.
Well, and we're coming to the end of the hour, but how I'm wrapping this up in my head is there's a systemic thing here, right? Like so many people are traumatized and not able to get the support that they need. Our culture is traumatizing, right? The fact that, we weren't meant to live in 3, 4, 5, 6 person households and take care of all of each other's needs at the same time, all of these things. And I'm also thinking too, in training of therapists, that there really needs to be more of an emphasis on connection to self, because we therapists, we're afraid of what we don't understand, right? And so a lot of people are afraid of tattoo culture. They're afraid of interacting with gay people if they haven't before, whatever. And so I'm wondering if we really did spend more time in these educational settings, learning about ourselves, connecting to our own authenticity and our own truth, and we would be more accepting of when we see something different in others.
Yes. The self of the therapist is this wildly underrated inner landscape that is just endless.
Yeah.
I just did a training not too long ago on decolonizing clinical supervision. And it was excellent. I mean, it was so good, but it was rooted in the simplicity of anytime the thought is there's a right way to do this. And if you don't learn that right way, you're not in the club, you're colonizing something. Just the simplicity of that, like before they got into cultural awareness or anything, just the whole, if you want in the old boys club, you do it this way.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, it was a wonderful trend. That's part of where I started learning about Harry Ponte, who I mentioned earlier, who's a social worker. I like to represent some LCSWs out there.
Same.
But yes, it's that whole inner process. I do a lot of what infant child psychotherapy called reflective supervision, but it's just kind of a way to keep licensed therapists in a form of supervision. Just like still working with what it's like to do the job. And that has been so helpful for so many people, and I always have somebody that I talk to too, but because it's just that, it's that if you sit down and you say, man, I just saw my 1 o'clock and he only said 1-word answers and he's off camera half the time and he was distracted by his phone and he wouldn't answer this question. It's very important that someone asks you, so why did it bother you that he did that? Because it probably didn't bother you when somebody else did that. Another one of your clients checked their phone during the session, stayed off of camera, didn't answer things really well, and you left there feeling like it went fine. So why him? And a safe enough reflective space to say, why him? And it could be an invalidating thing. It could be that, a person struggles with working with trans youth and doesn't validate that well and feels uncomfortable in that space. And it's like, good news. Some people aren't scared of that space. Mm-hmm. So let's talk to them. Let's find that space. Because if you can't actively validate and you can't look inward for what scares you off, you're going to continue to try to shut that down. And most of what happens in therapy, as we know, is nonverbal and it's indirect. And you're a therapist, so you are artful at maneuvering emotional topics, even if that maneuvering is to maneuver them out of the frame.
Right.
You're going to be able to do that in some really subtle, nuanced ways because you're a brilliant emotional being. You're a therapist. Mm-hmm. So you have to have those checks and balances. And those checks and balances should be interesting to you. I want supervision and reflective processes to be something that people look forward to every time we talk.
Absolutely. And I think as a supervisor, inviting the whole therapist into the room and making space for that is so healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a scary job.
Right. Well, you have brought a lot of curiosity, I'm sure, to many people who are listening. So I think you nailed it. Great job. Do you want to tell folks where they can find you?
Yeah. Best place to find me, actually, like our practice site is findyourlightsource.com. That's the whole group. That's our supervision stuff. And I always do offer reflective process. So anybody out there that does want to look into having their own outside objective kind of reflective supervisor, we do offer that here. I just think it's so important.
Absolutely.
It's just been a great addition to my career.
Right. And so important for the trauma field specifically. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been so wonderful to get to know you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website, www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.